Okay, good morning. Let's try this again. It should have been posted, yeah? Alright, this is Wool by Hugh, Howey. We are starting from chapter 10. Chapter 10. It was lunchtime, but neither of them was powerfully hungry. Johns nibbled on a corn bar while she talked, priding herself on eating on the climb like a porter. They continued to pass these tradesmen, and John's self-esteem of their profession grew and grew. She had a strange pang of guilt from heading down under such a light load, while these men and women trudged up carrying so much. And they moved so fast. She and Marnes pressed themselves against the rail as a downward porter apologetically stomped past. His shadow, a girl of 15 or 16, was right behind him, loaded down with what looked to be sacks of garbage for the recycling center. Johns watched the young girl spiral out of sight, her sinewy and smooth legs hanging miles out of her shorts, and suddenly felt very old and very tired. The two of them fell into a rhythmic pace, the reach of each foot hovering over the next tread, a sort of collapsing of the bones, a resignation to gravity, falling to that foot, sliding the hand, extending the walking stick forward, repeat. Doubt crept into John's around the 30th floor. What had seemed a fine adventure at sunrise now seemed a mighty undertaking. Each step was performed reluctantly, with the knowledge of how grueling it would be to win that elevation back. They passed the upper water treatment plant on 32, and Johns realized she was seeing portions of the silo that were practically new to her. It had been a lifetime ago that she had been this deep, a shameful thing to admit, and in that time changes had been made. Construction and repairs were ongoing. Walls were a different color than she remembered. But then, it was hard to trust one's memory. The traffic on the stairs lightened as they neared the IT floors. Here were the most sparsely populated levels of the silo, where less than 24 men and women, but mostly men, operated within their own little kingdom. The silo servers took up almost an entire floor, the machines slowly reloading, with recent history having been wiped completely during the uprising. Access to them was now severely restricted, and as Johns passed the landing on the 33rd, she swore she could hear the mighty thrumming of all the electricity that they consumed. Whatever the silo had been, or had been originally designed for, she knew without asking or being told that these strange machines were some organ of primacy. Their power draw was a constant source of contention during budget meetings, but the necessity of the cleaning, the fear of even talking about the outside, and all the dangerous taboos that went with it gave IT incredible leeway. They housed the labs that made the suits, each one tailored to the person waiting in the holding cell, and this alone set them apart from all else. No, Johns told herself. It wasn't simply the taboo of the cleaning, the fear of the outside, it was the hope. There was this unspoken, deadly hope in every member of the silo, a ridiculous, fantastical hope that maybe not for them, but perhaps for their children or their children's children, life on the outside would be possible once again, and that it would be the work of IT and the bulky suits that emerged from their labs that would make it all possible. Johns felt a shiver even to think it. Living outside. The childhood conditioning was that strong. Maybe God would hear her thoughts and rat her out. She imagined herself in a cleaning suit, a far too common of a thought, placing herself into the flexible coffin to which she had condemned so many. On the 34th, she slipped off onto the landing. Marnes joined her, his canteen in his hand. Johns realized she'd been drinking out of his all day while hers had stayed strapped to her back. There was something childlike and romantic about this, but also something practical. It was more difficult to reach one's own water than it was to grab that of the other from their pack. You need a break? He passed the canteen, which had 2 swallows left in it. Johns took one of them. This is our next stop, she said. Martins looked up at the faded numbers stenciled over the doorway. He had to know what floor they were on, but it was as if he needed to double check. Johns returned to his canteen. In the past, I've always wired them to get the okay on my nominations. It was something Mayor Humphreys did before me and Mayor Jeffers before him. She shrugged. Way of the world. I didn't know they had to approve. He took the last swallow and patted Johns on the back, twirled his finger for her to turn around. Well, they've never rejected any of my nominations. Johns felt her canteen tugged out of her pouch. Martin's canteen shoved in its place. Her pack felt a smidgen lighter. She realized Martins wanted to carry her water and share it until it, too, was empty. I think the unwritten rule is there just so we'll carefully consider every judge and lawman, knowing there's some formal oversight. So this time you're doing it in person. She turned around to face her deputy. I figured we were passing this way. She paused while a young couple hurried up the stairs behind Martins, holding hands and taking the treads 2 at a time. And that it might feel even more conspicuous not to stop and check in. Check in? Martins said. Johns half expected him to spit over the railing. The tone seemed to require such punctuation. She suddenly felt another of her weaknesses exposed. Think of it as a goodwill mission, she said, turning towards the door. I'm going to think of it as a fact-finding raid, Martins muttered, following her. Johns could tell that, unlike at the nursery, they would not be buzzed through and sent back into the mysterious depths of IT. While they waited to be seen, she watched as even a member of the staff, identifiable from their silver overalls, was patted down and searched, just to leave the wing and exit towards the stairs. A man with a wand, a number of IT's own internal security detail, seemed to have the job of checking everyone who passed through the metal gates. The receptionist on the outside of the gates was different, however, and seemed pleased to have the mayor for a visit. She expressed her condolences for the recent cleaning, an odd thing to say, but something Johns wished she heard more often. They were shown to a small conference room attached to the main foyer, a place, she supposed, for meeting with various departments, without putting them through the hassle of passing through security. Look at all this space. Martins whispered once they were alone in the room together. Did you see the size of that entrance hall? Johns nodded. She looked around the ceiling and walls for some peephole, something to confirm the creepy sensation that she was being watched. She set her bag and walking stick down and collapsed warily onto the plush chairs. When it moved, she realized the thing was on wheels. Nicely oiled wheels. I've always wanted to check this place out, Martins said. That was supposed to be a guy. Always wanted to check this place out, Martins said. He peered through the glass window that looked back into the wide foyer. Every time I pass this place, and it's only been a dozen times or so, I'm curious to see what's inside. Johns nearly asked him to stop talking, but worried that it would hurt his feelings. Boy, he's coming in a hurry. Must be because of you. Johns turned and looked out the window to see Bernard Holland heading their way. He disappeared from view as he approached the door. The handle flicked down, and the small man whose job it was to keep IT running smoothly strode into the room. Mayor. Bernard was all teeth, the front ones crooked. He had a wispy mustache that hung down in a weak attempt to hide this flaw. Short, portly, and with a pair of glasses perched on his small nose, he looked every bit the technical expert. Above all, to Johns at least, he looked smart. He reached for John's hand as she rose from the chair, the blasted thing nearly scooting out from underneath her as she pressed down on the armrests. Careful, Bernard said, grabbing her elbow to steady her. Deputy. He nodded towards Martin's while Johns regained her balance. It's an honor to have you down. I know you don't take these trips often. Thanks for seeing us on such short notice, John said. Of course. Please, make yourselves comfortable. He swept his hand over the lacquered conference table. It was nicer than the one in the mayor's office, though John assuaged herself by assuming it was shiny from being less frequently employed. She sat in the chair warily, then reached into her bag and produced the set of files. Straight to business, as always, Bernard said, sitting beside her. He pushed his small, round spectacles up his nose and glided forward on the chair until his plump belly met the desk. Always appreciated that about you. We are, as you can imagine with yesterday's unfortunate events, as busy as ever. Lots of data to go through. How's that going? Johns asked while she arranged the material in front of her. Some positives and negatives, as always. Readouts from the seal sensors showed improvement. Atmospheric levels of 8 of the known toxins have declined, though not by much. 2 have risen. Most have remained unchanged. He waved his hand. It's a lot of boring technical stuff, but it'll all be in my report. I should have it ported up to you before you get back to your office. That'll be fine, John said. She wanted to say something else, to acknowledge his department's hard work, to let him know that another cleaning had been successful, God knew why. But it was Holston out there, the closest thing she ever had to a shadow. The only man she'd ever seen running for her office when she was dead and feeding the roots of the fruit trees. It was too soon to mention it, much less applaud it. I normally wire this sort of thing to you, she said, but since we were passing by and you won't be up for the next committee meeting for, another 3 months? The years go by fast, Bernard said. I just figured we could formally agree to this now so I could offer our best candidate for the job. She glanced up at Marnes. Once she accepts, we can finish the paperwork on our way back up, if you don't mind. She slid the folder toward Bernard and was surprised when he produced one of his own, rather than accept hers. Well, let's go over this, Bernard said. He opened his folder, licked his thumb, and flipped through a few pieces of high-quality paper. We were worried about your visit, but your list of candidates didn't hit my desk until this morning. Otherwise, I would have tried to save you the trip down and back up. He pulled out a piece of paper devoid of creases. It didn't even look bleached. Johns wondered where IT got such things while her office was held together with cornflour paste. I'm thinking, of the 3 names listed here, that Billings is our man. We may consider him next, John started to say. I think we should consider him now. He slid the paper towards Johns. It was an acceptance contract. There were signatures at the bottom. 1 line was left blank, the mayor's name neatly printed underneath. She had to catch her breath. You've already contacted Peter Billings about this? He accepted. The judge's robe was going to be a little stifling for him, being so young and full of energy. I thought he was a fine choice for that role. But I think he's an even better one now for the job of sheriff. Johns remembered Peter's judicial nomination process. It had been one of the times she'd gone along with Bernard's suggestion, seeing it as a trade for a future pick of her own. She studied the signature, Peter's hand familiar from his various notes, sent up on behalf of Judge Wilson, under whom he currently shadowed. She imagined one of the porters who had flown past them on the steps that day, apologizing as they went, rushing this very piece of paper down. I'm afraid Peter is actually currently 3rd on our list, Mary Johns finally said. Her voice suddenly felt tired. It sounded frail and weak in the cavernous and wasteful space of that underused and outsized conference room. She looked up at Marnes, who was glaring at the contract. his jaw clenching and unclenching. Well, I think we both know Murphy's name is on the list for flattery. He's too old for the job. Younger than me, Marnes interrupted. I hold up just fine. Bernard tilted his head. Yes, well, your first choice simply won't do, I'm afraid. And why is that? Johns asked. I'm not sure how thorough your background check has been, but we've had enough problems with this candidate that I recognized her name, even though she's from mechanical. Bernard said this last word like it was full of nails and might gut him to spit it out. What kind of problems? Marnes demanded. John shot the deputy a look of warning. Nothing we would have wanted to report, mind you. Bernard turned to Marnes. There was venom in the small man's eyes, a raw hatred for the deputy, or perhaps for the star on his chest. Nothing worth involving the law. But there have been some creative requisitions from her office, items rerouted from our use, improper claims of priority, and the like. Bernard took a deep breath and folded his hands together on top of the folder in front of him. I wouldn't go so far as to call it stealing per se, but we have filed complaints with Deacon Knox as head of mechanical to inform him of these irregularities. That's it, Marnes growled. Requisitions? Bernard frowned. He spread his hands on the folder. That's it. Have you been listening? The woman has practically stolen goods, has had items rerouted from my department. It's not clear if they are even for silo use. They could be for personal gain. God knows. The woman uses more than her allowance of electricity. Maybe she trades for chits. Is this a formal accusation? Marnes asked. I was supposed to be a guy too. Is this a formal accusation? Marnes asked. He made a show of pulling his pad from his pocket and clicking his mechanical pen. No. As I said, we would not want to trouble your office, but as you can see, this is not the sort of person to enter a career in high law. It's what I expect of a mechanic, to be honest, which is where I'm afraid this candidate should stay. He patted the folder as if putting the issue to rest. Well, that's your suggestion, Mayor John said. Why, yes. And I think, since we have such a fine candidate ready and willing to serve and already living in the up top, I'll take your suggestion into account. Johns took the crisp contract from the table and deliberately folded it in half, pinching the crease with her fingernails as she slid them down its length. She stuck the piece of paper in one of her folders while Bernard watched horrified. And since you have no formal complaints about our first candidate, I will take this as tacit approval to speak with her about the job. John stood and grabbed her bag. She slid the folders into the outside pouch and secured the flap, then grabbed her walking stick from where it leaned against the conference table. Thank you for seeing us. Yes, but Bernard scooted away from the table and hurried after as John made for the door. Marnes got up and followed, smiling. What should I tell Peter? He's of the assumption that he starts any time. You should never have told him anything, John said. She stopped in the foyer and glanced at Bernard. I gave you my list in confidence. You betrayed that. Now, I appreciate all you do for the silo. You and I have a long and peaceable history working together, overseeing what might be the most prosperous age our people have known. Which is why, Bernard began, which is why I am forgiving this trespass, Mayor Johns said. This is my job. My people. They elected me to make these kinds of decisions. So my deputy and I will be on our way. We will give our top choice a fair interview, and I will be sure to stop by on my way up in case there is anything to sign. Bernard spread his hands in defeat. Very well, he said. I apologize. I only hope to expedite the process. Now, please, rest a little. You are our guests. Let me get you some food, perhaps some fruit. We'll be on our way, John said. Fine, he nodded. At least some water. Top up your canteens. John's remembered one of them was already empty, and they had a few more flights to go. That would be a kind gesture, she said. She signaled to Marnes, who turned so she could grab his canteen from his pack. Then she turned her back so he could grab hers as well. Bernard waved to one of his workers to come fetch them and fill them up, but the entire time he kept his eyes on this curious and intimate exchange. Chapter 11. They were almost down to the 50s before Johns could think straight. She imagined she could feel the weight of Peter Billings' contract in her pack. Marnes muttered his own complaints from a few steps behind, bitching about Bernard and trying to keep up, and Johns realized she was fixated now. The weariness in her thighs and calves had become compounded by the growing sense that this trip was more than a mistake. It was probably futile. A father who warns her that his daughter won't accept pressure from IT to choose another. Now each step of their descent was taken with dread. Dread and yet a new certainty that Juliet was the person for the job. They would have to convince this woman from Mechanical to take the post, if only to show Bernard, if only to keep this arduous journey from becoming a total waste. Johns was old, had been mayor a long time, partly because she got things done and partly because she prevented worse things from happening, but mostly because she rarely made a ruckus. She felt like it was about time, now, while she was old enough for the consequences not to matter. She glanced back at Marnes and knew the same went for him. Their time was almost up. The best, most important thing they could do for the silo was to make sure their legacy endured. No uprisings, no abuses of power. It was why she had run unopposed in the last few elections, but now she could sense that she was gliding to the finish while stronger and younger runners were preparing to overtake her. How many judges had she signed off on at Bernard's request? And now the sheriff, too. How long before Bernard was mayor? Or worse, a puppet master with strings interwoven throughout the silo? Take it easy, Marnes huffed. Johns realized she was going too fast. She slowed her pace. The bastard's got you all riled up, he said. And you better be as well, she hissed back at him. You're passing the gardens. Johns checked the landing number and saw that he was right. If she had been paying attention, she would have noticed the smell. When the doors on the next landing flew open, a porter bearing sacks of fruit on each shoulder strode out, the scent of lush and wet vegetation accompanying him and overpowering her. It was past dinner time and the smell was intoxicating. The porter, even though overburdened, saw that they were leaving the stairwell for the landing and held the door open with a planted foot as his arms bulged around the weight of the large sacks. Mayor, he said, bowing his head, and then nodding to Marnes as well. Johns thanked him. Most of the porters looked familiar to her. She'd seen them over and over as they delivered throughout the silo, but they never stayed in one place long enough for her to catch and remember a name, normally a keen skill of hers. She wondered, as she and Marnes entered the hydroponic farms, if the porters made it home every night to be with their families. Or did they even have families? Were they like the priests? She was too old and too curious not to know these things, but then maybe it took a day on the stairwell to appreciate their job and to notice them fully. The porters were like the air she breathed, always there, always serving, so necessary as to be ubiquitous and taken for granted. But now, the wariness of the descent had opened her senses completely to them. It was like a sudden drop in the oxygen, triggering her appreciation. Oh, smell those oranges, Martin said, snapping Johns out of her thoughts. He sniffed the air as they passed through the low garden gates. A staff member in green overalls waved them through. "Bags here, Mayor," he said, gesturing to a wall cubbies sporadically filled with shoulder bags and bundles. Johns complied, leaving her kit in one of the cubbies. Marnes pushed hers to the back and added his to the same one. Whether it was to save space or merely his habitual protectiveness, Johns found the act as sweet as the air inside of the gardens. "We have reservations for the evening," Johns told the worker. He nodded. "One flight down for the rooms. I believe they're still getting yours ready. Are you here just for a visit or to eat?" "A little of both." The young man smiled. "Well, by the time you've had a bite, your room should be available." Rooms, Johns thought. She thanked the young man and followed Marnes into the garden network. "How long since you were here?" she asked the deputy. "Wow. A while back. 4 years or so." "That's right. How could I forget the heist of the century?" "I'm glad you think that's funny," Marnes said. At the end of the hallway, the twisting spiral of the hydroponic gardens diverted off both ways. The main tunnel snaked through the two levels of the silo, curving maze-like all the way to the edges of the distant concrete walls. The constant sound of water dripping from the pipes was oddly soothing, the splatters echoing off the low ceiling. The tunnel was open on either side, revealing the bushy green of plants, vegetables, and small trees growing amid the lattice of white plastic pipes twined strung everywhere to give the creeping vines and stems something to hold. Men and women with their young shadows tended to the plants, all in green overalls. Sacks hung around their necks, bulged with the day's harvest, and the cutters in their hands clacked like little claws that were a biological part of them. The pruning was mesmerizingly adroit and effortless, the sort of ability that came only from day after week after year of practice and repetition. "Weren't you the first one to suggest the thievery was an inside job?" Johns asked, still laughing to herself. She and Marnes followed the signs pointing toward the tasting and dining halls. "Are we really going to talk about this?" "I don't know why it's embarrassing. You've got to laugh at it." "With time." He stopped and gazed through the mesh fencing at a stand of tomatoes. The powerful odor of their ripeness made John's stomach grumble. "We were really hyped up to make a bust at that time," Martin said quietly. "Holston was a mess during all of this. He was wiring me every night for an update. I've never seen him want to take someone down so bad, like you really needed to, you know." He wrapped his fingers in the protective grate and stared past the vegetables as if into the years gone by. Looking back, it's almost like he knew something was up with Allison, like he saw the madness coming. Mine's turned to John's. "Do you remember what it was like before she cleaned? It had been so long. Everyone was on edge." Johns had long since stopped smiling. She stood close to Marnes. He turned back to the plants, watched a worker snip off a red ripe tomato and place it in her basket. "I think Holston wanted to let the air out of the silo, you know. I think he wanted to come down and investigate the thefts himself. Kept wiring me every day for reports like a life depended on it." "I'm sorry to bring it up," John said, resting a hand on his shoulder. Marnes turned and looked at the back of her hand. His bottom lip was visible below his mustache. Johns could picture him kissing her hand. She pulled it away. "It's fine," he said. "Without all that baggage, I guess it is pretty funny." He turned and continued down the hallway. "Did they ever figure out how it got in here?" "Up the stairwell," Marnes said. "Had to be. Though I heard one person suggest that a child could have stolen one to keep as a pet and then released it up here." Johns laughed. She couldn't help herself. "One rabbit," she said, "confounding the greatest lawman of our time and making off with a year's salary of greens." Marnes shook his head and chuckled a little. "Not the greatest," he said. That was never me. He peered down the hallway and cleaned his throat, and Johns knew perfectly well who he was thinking of. After a large and satisfying dinner, they retired a level down to the guest rooms. Johns had a suspicion that extra pains had been taken to accommodate them. Every room was packed, many of them double and triple booked, and since the cleaning had been scheduled well before this last minute interview of theirs, she suspected rooms had been bumped around to make space. The fact that they had been given separate rooms, the mayor's with two beds, made it worse. It wasn't just the waste, it was the arrangement. Johns was hoping to be more inconvenienced. And Martins must have felt the same way, since it was still hours before bedtime and they were both buzzing from a fine meal and strong wine. He asked her to his small room so they could chat while the gardens settled down. His room was tastefully cozy, with only a single twin bed, but nicely appointed. The upper gardens were one of just a dozen large private enterprises. All the expenses for their stay would be covered by her office's travel budget, and that money, as well as the fares of other travelers, helped the establishment afford finer things, like nice sheets from the looms and a mattress that didn't squeak. John sat on the foot of the bed. Martins took off his holster, placed it on the dresser, and plopped onto a changing bench just a few feet away. While she kicked off her boots and rubbed her sore feet, he went on and on about the food, the waste of separate rooms, brushing his mustache down with his hand as he spoke. Johns worked her thumbs into the soreness in her heels. Oh, I feel like I'm going to need a week of rest at the bottom before we start the climb up, she said during a pause. It's not all that bad, Mines told her. You watch. You'll be sore in the morning, but once you start moving, you'll find that you're stronger than you were today, and it's the same on the way up. You just lean into each step, and before you know it, you're home. Oh, I hope you're right, she said. Besides, we'll do it in 4 days instead of two. Just think of it as an adventure. Trust me, John said. I already am. They sat quietly for a while, John's resting back on the pillows and Martin staring off into space. She was surprised to find how calming and natural it was, just being in a room, alone, with him. The talk wasn't necessary. They could just be. No badge, no office, two people. You don't take a priest, do you? Martins finally asked. No, she shook her head. Do you? I haven't, but I've been thinking about it. Wholesome? Partly. He leaned forward and rubbed his hands down his thighs like he was squeezing the sore out of them. I'd like to hear where they think his soul has gone. It's all still with us, John said. That's what they'd say anyway. What do you believe? Me? She pushed herself up from the pillows and rested on one elbow, watching him watch her. I don't know, really. I keep too busy to think about it. Do you think Donald's soul is still here with us? Johns felt a shiver. She couldn't remember the last time someone had uttered his name. He's been gone more years than he was ever my husband, she said. I've been married more to his ghost than to him. That don't seem like the right thing to say. Johns looked down at the bed, the world a little blurry. I don't think he'd mind. And yes, he's still with me. He motivates me every day to be a good person. I feel him watching me all the time. Me too, Ryan said. Johns looked up and saw that he was staring at her. Do you think he'd want you to be happy? In all things, I mean? He stopped rubbing his legs and sat there, hands on his knees, until he had to look away. You were his best friend, John said. What do you think he'd want? He rubbed his face, glanced toward the closed door as a laughing child thundered down the hallway. I reckon he only ever wanted you to be happy. That's why he was the man for you. John wiped her eyes while he wasn't looking and peered curiously down at her wet fingers. It's getting late, she said. She slid to the edge of the small bed and reached down for her boots. Her bag and stick were waiting for her by the door. I think you're right. I think I'll be a little sore in the morning, but I think I'll feel stronger eventually. We're going to end there for the day. We're on chapter 12. And we will start again tomorrow morning. Thanks for tuning in.